Good evening. Y'all look all lonely over there. We are in chapter 10 of 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, if you want to open up to that chapter, we will pick up there in verse number 1 here in just a moment. 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Before we get started tonight, though, let's begin with a prayer. And Evan, can I call on you to lead us in prayer as we start?
Dear Father, as we come to you in prayer, we're so very thankful that we have this stage that we can come and worship you. Dear Father, we pray that you're with our Bible class this evening. May we do as much as we possibly can. Be with Eric and the other teachers as they're in the other classes teaching, and may things go well there as well. Please, dear Father, just watch over us and this congregation. In the name of Jesus we pray. Amen.
All right, chapter 10. If you recall, on Sunday, we wrapped up chapter 9. And what was kind of the overall driving message of chapter 9 that Paul was dealing with and talking about? If you recall, kind of a main theme of the chapter, what would you say the main theme of chapter 9 was? Yeah, Paul's use of liberty. He gave up rights that he had. He gave up freedoms. But at the same time, what did he do for others, to win others? Yeah, he met them where they were. He became all things to all men is the language that is used in chapter 9. And so chapter 10, he's going then to talk about temptation. He's going to talk about our faithfulness to God and God's faithfulness to us. And he begins after he says about being all things to all men. And he says in chapter 9 and verse 27, I discipline my body and make it my slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified. Then he goes into chapter 10 and verse number 1, 4. He connects it here back to the last part. I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that our fathers were all under the cloud and passed through the sea. And so now he's going to talk about why he does some of these things and the examples and lessons we learn from those who have gone before us, those who were the forefathers of these individuals in Corinth, and the lessons we still learn from them, Jeff.
It's all part of a section from chapter 8, including 9, including 10.
Yeah.
Because 8 verse 1 says, now concerning the things, and he's talking about the things that they had written to him about, offered to idols. You're going to find mentions of idolatry in chapter 10 because he's continuing his thought. They didn't have the chapters written when Paul wrote the book, so those chapters divisions just happen to fall here. But it's all talking about how to treat others and deal with their questions of food that was offered to idols, meats and things.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. It kind of ties these sections together that we've been looking at here in the last couple weeks of chapters 8, 9, and 10 here. And so we pick up then in chapter 10. Someone read the first 6 verses for us, if you would, of that context there. Excuse me. Thank you. And then verse 11, I'm going to read real quick, kind of ties into this. Now, the things happened to them as an example, and they were written for our instruction, upon whom the ends of the ages have arrived. Excuse me. So question number 1, what lessons do we learn from Israel's failures in the wilderness, and why were these examples written for us today?
I expect obedience.
Yeah. Paul in his writing here gives them some reminders. The Lord's people were under the cloud. What did that cloud do? The cloud that Paul is referencing.
That was God's leadership.
Yeah. If the cloud moved, what did the people do? They moved. It was kind of guiding them, directing them. They were guided, protected by God through that. They passed through the sea. They were baptized into Moses. They ate spiritual food, drank spiritual drink. They had Christ as their spiritual rock. All of these things, Paul says, these were all the things they had. And so on the surface, if you look at all these things, you think, well, these people have everything handed to them. It should be easy to follow after God. It should be easy to be a disciple and follow God, because everything seems like everything was provided for them to make it necessary to be faithful to God. But Paul reminds them, with most of them, God was not well pleased. Even though they had all of these blessings, and even though they had all of these things, God still was not pleased with them. And so because of that, we see many of them died. How did your version read there, Mel, in verse 5, that they were scattered in the wilderness? This version says struck down in the wilderness. They were destroyed because God was not well pleased with them. And so there are lessons that we learn from this. And one of them, Evan pointed out, being obedient to God is a requirement that God desires from us. Being faithful to God. Yeah, Evan.
I like the foreshadowing here in this aspect, because it talks about all passed under the cloud, all passed through the sea. Well, what's the cloud made of? Water. They passed through the sea. What was that? Water. It's like they were baptized in a sense. And like when we are baptized, we are in the water. We're surrounded by water. We come up. We're a new person. These the children of Israel were basically, in a sense, figuratively, symbolically baptized, and they, of course, went on and received the law of Moses and so forth. But they really became children of God, and God expected more from them than just simple disobedience.
Yeah. The history we read in the Bible isn't just history for our knowledge. As it says there in verse number 6, these things happen to them as examples. We learn from examples. How many times have we seen people fail at doing a certain task, and then they try to do the same task and they do it the exact same way, and they fail again? And they try to do the exact same task the same way, and they fail again. There's a word for that. It's a little foolish, isn't it? These things happened as an example so that we don't follow in the same pattern and do the same things, where we think that we are with God, but yet we're not with God because we're not obedient to God. Obedience is necessary for us. This also shows us that God's people have always been vulnerable at drifting away from God. How many times have we seen throughout the Old Testament, throughout the Lord's people, the history of faithfulness followed by unfaithfulness, followed by faithfulness again, followed by unfaithfulness again? There's a pattern that has been there. And I also think we're warned about developing sinful desires and following after those sinful desires. Paul in the next section is going to talk about some of the things that they were guilty of, that the fathers were guilty of, that he's warning them not to follow in those footsteps as well. But those are some lessons we learn as we look at those first few verses, any thoughts on those first 6 verses before we jump into verse 7? All right, verses 7 through 10. Would someone read verses 7 through 10 for us?
And do not become idolaters as were some of them. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. Nor let us commit sexual immorality as some of them did. And in one day 23,000 fell. Nor let us tempt Christ as some of them also tempted and were destroyed by serpents. Nor complain as some of them also complained and were destroyed by the destroyer.
Okay, and then again, verse 11 ties right back into it, what we saw earlier. These things happened to them as an example, and they were written for our instruction, upon whom the ends of the ages have arrived. And so again, question number 2, what 4 specific sins does Paul warn Christians to avoid based on Israel's history? What's one of the things that Paul mentions here that is idolatry? This is one that I think it's easy for us to say, well, we don't have idolatry today. We don't have idols today. We don't see people bowing down to an object today. Maybe we don't, but maybe we do. Not in the, go ahead.
It's more subtle than that.
Yeah.
You know, it's not literally prostrating yourself. I'll get that word right. It's not taking yourself down in front of a stone carving. It's what you do with your time and your money and your effort.
Yeah. Yeah. Jeff.
Education is a big one in the world today.
Yeah.
It is their idol, and they worship education.
Yeah. Especially those people at Purdue University. Kidding. Ball State's much better, though. But then there's IU. That one time was the Party School of America. Never mind. But yeah, there's a lot of different things that we have made an idol, that we're not physically bowing down to it, that we're not putting it on a shelf in our house and we're offering prayers to it. But yeah, how much time do we spend with different hobbies and interests, and what do we spend our money on? What's our main focus? What is the definition of idolatry? In your own words, Evan, what would you say if someone says, Evan, what's idolatry mean?
Well, there are 2 things I would like to mention. Number 1, idolatry is putting something before God. And that's, of course, what the people did here. Going back to the previous point that you made, there is idol worship going on today. Not in this country per se.
Exactly, yeah.
But in other places around the world, there's still idolatry. Believe it or not, it still happens.
Yeah.
But idolatry itself is putting something before God. It's like, so what are we putting before God? And if it's money, is it fame, is it whatever it is?
Yeah.
That's idolatry.
Yeah. And yeah, there is still idol worship where for our sake and what most of us are ever going to experience here, it's not something that we necessarily see as much. Does that still happen here in the U.S. still? In certain places? Sure it does. But it's not as prevalent as what it was for this period when Paul's writing for us locally here in the States. But anything we put before God becomes our idol. And so, golf. Let's pick on golf. I love playing golf. I know a lot of people that spend way too much money and way too much time playing golf. It becomes what they're most interested in. But the same thing can be applied to any sport. It can be applied to a vehicle, an automobile that maybe you have an old 1965 fastback Mustang, and that's your idol. Whatever it is, anything that we're putting before God is idolatry. People had a problem with it. It's still a problem today that we see in with members of the church, that they're still struggling with putting things before God. What's another sin that Paul makes mention of?
Sexual immorality.
You both can have half credit. Yeah, sexual immorality. We know sexual immorality is an issue in the church at Corinth. We just spent time in chapters 5, 6, and 7 talking about the issues of sexual immorality. Is it still an issue for us today? Absolutely. Absolutely. There's still issues with that today. What's another sin that's given here? Grumbling. What does grumbling mean? Complaining, angry, ungrateful. Were they happy with the manna that was given to them in the wilderness? At first, maybe, but eventually they got tired of it. With those of you with kids, I'm sure you've experienced this when it's time to get ready to go to a family function and you say, hey, I want you to look a little bit nicer today than sweatpants. Oh, why do I got to wear jeans for? You know, why do I got to wear, look, it's just family. And it's like, well, there's going to be pictures taken. And it's just a fight sometimes. I mention that because I'm preparing myself for tomorrow morning when we get ready to go see family. But how much time do we see the same thing that our kids do in grumbling and complaining? How much time do we see that in ourselves even, or in the church, where people just are unhappy and grouchy? Roy, I see your hand go up. Okay. I saw it in the corner of my eyes. I couldn't tell. But the idea of grumbling and complaining was this problem. And perhaps this is a great time to talk about this one. Tomorrow it's a day of Thanksgiving, a day to be thankful for what we have. Not a day to complain for what we don't have, what we're lacking, but be thankful for the blessings we have in this life.
Complaining just weakens the whole group.
Yeah,
Kind of, it can spread, like a virus or an infection or something,
yeah,
and bring others down.
yeah. Go to a local sporting event. You know, if officiating crews aren't doing what we think is good, and one parent starts complaining, then the other parent's going to feed off of that. Now you have a whole side complaining, and it does. It kind of spreads like gangrene, doesn't it? It causes issues. Miss Peggy.
Some people make it a hobby to complain. And when you know somebody like that, it just kind of spreads, makes everybody feel kind of guilt.
Yeah.
But some people feel they thrive.
They just want to stir the pot and be a Debbie Downer all the time, don't they? And kind of spread those things. So what's the last sin that Paul mentions here? In these four? Yeah, putting Christ to the test. How do we put Christ to the test? How do we put Christ to the test?
I think back to the Israelites where it was just like a big circle. They just kept doing the same things over and over again. They fuss, and then they get taken into captivity or whatever, and they be sin and judged, and then they behave and they get better, and then it just started all over again. I mean, is that what you're looking for?
Yeah.
I think of the scribes and the Pharisees that just hounded Jesus. And they'd ask him questions, and they'd ask him more questions, and they'd ask him more questions. And it wasn't that they wanted to be enlightened. It was so that they could try to catch him in something. And we have the evidence, enough testimony to believe
Yeah.
So don't test Jesus, because the proof is already there.
So here's my follow-up question to that. Is there a difference between putting Christ to the test and having real raw emotions as you're praying to Christ, as you're praying to God, as you're talking to God? Is asking God why something happened putting God to the test, putting Christ to the test? Family member gets sick or family member dies, and we, in our raw emotions, God, why did you allow this to happen? Is that testing God?
I don't think so. I think that's just human emotion. Job questioned God, but up to a point, God said it was okay to question, but just don't demand answers for things that you shouldn't have.
Brian?
It depends on our attitude, because Job is a good example of asking questions, but in this case, this idea that is talking about, sending the fiery serpents, they were asking questions as well, but it was a whole different type of attitude.
Yeah.
In Numbers, the 21st chapter, it was talking about the people speaking against God and Moses. Why have you brought us out of Egypt to die? There's no food, there's no water. There is a definite difference between questioning in our heart for us to understand and questioning as a complaint.
Yeah.
David wrote, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" But he still wanted to worship God. Jesus quotes that on the cross, but he still believed in God. Psalm 42, verses 1 and 2. As the deer pants for the water, so my soul longs for you. But if you read the entire psalm, it's a lament. It's asking questions, but I'm still longing after you and pursuing after you. And I trust in your way, because God's ways are bigger than man's ways.
Yeah.
And we need to realize it's okay to have those raw emotions and to speak out in prayer to God, but don't run away from it.
Yeah. I think it's right. I think there's the emotion, the intent of the heart, all of those things kind of play in. Habakkuk, I think, is a great example. Back in Habakkuk chapter 1, the oracle which Habakkuk the prophet beheld, how long, O Yahweh, will I call for help, and you will not hear? I cry out to you violence, yet you do not save. Why do you make me see wickedness and cause me to look on trouble? Indeed, devastation and violence are before me, and there is strife and contention is lifted up. Therefore the law is ignored, and justice never comes forth. For the wicked surround the righteous. Therefore justice comes forth perverted. And so we see Habakkuk is laying out, God, how long is this going to go on? Why do I have to experience this? But what does Habakkuk say at the end of his? In chapter 3, Habakkuk chapter 3, at the end, he says, though the fig tree should not blossom, and there be no produce on the vines, though the yield of the olive should fail, and the fields yield no food, though the flock should be cut off from the fold, and there be no cattle in the stalls, he says, yet I will exalt in Yahweh. I will rejoice in the God of my salvation. Yahweh the Lord is my strength, and he has set my feet like hinds' feet, and makes me tread on my high places for the choir director on my stringed instruments. He could have had those questions at the beginning and then cursed God, but he didn't. There's a difference between raw emotion and also testing. As you put out, the Pharisees and the scribes who tested Christ, who were seeing what could they get away with, what things did Christ really want them to do. We kind of do the same thing when we toe the line with sin. How close can I get to sin before Christ is going to before anything's going to happen to me, or well, how far can I get before this becomes sinful? And we like to play that what if game. That, when I think, is when our heart and our mind and our attitude has changed from, God, I'm giving you all my questions, to what can I get away with? And so I think there's a difference there between raw emotion and testing God. Any thoughts on that?
The example of Jonah doing the same thing.
Yeah.
He passed that line to test at the end where he started asking God about saving Nineveh and the plant being withered away.
Yeah.
So, I think right on that it really comes back to what's the reasoning and what's our attitude.
Yeah.
Are we still loving and worshiping God? Or are we pushing back on what His will is?
Absolutely. All right, so let's continue on then and see how far we can get here in chapter 10. Verse number 12 says, "Therefore, let him who thinks he stands take heed that he does not fall." And question 3, what warning does Paul give in verse 12 to those who are prideful? And how should this caution us in the church today? This is tying back exactly to what the Israelites were going through, that their pride was getting to them. They thought they could do what they wanted, they could test God, they could live how they wanted. And what eventually happened to them? Well, the Lord reminded us that they were struck in the wilderness. There were many of them who died in the wilderness. The day that they were involved in sexual immorality, 23,000 fell in one day. We see this happen. So what's the warning for us about pride, and how does this apply to us?
Pride's always going to be an issue regardless. And we need to be careful because even we see the strongest people we would think, and we say, well, they'll never fall. Well, they did. And that should scare us and put a warning to us that anybody is capable of falling and sinning before God. We have to always be on guard. We always have to be alert.
Yeah, when we become too prideful, I think we think we are indestructible. We think that we can begin to live in sin, and we begin to toy with sin and think we can go into sin and not have to face the consequences for the sin that we are involved in, and that's simply not the case. Eventually we're going to be humbled, and we're going to have to answer for the things that we do. And so there is a warning there. And so he says in verse 13, "No temptation has overtaken you, but such as is common to man, but God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation will provide the way of escape also, so that you will be able to endure it." And so question 4, according to verse 13, how does God provide help when we face temptation? He does two things in this verse for us. What does he do? Yeah, he provides a way of escape. Yeah. And there's also a piece of information I think is very important for us. And that's the fact that he says, "No temptation has overtaken you, but such as is common to man." The temptations that you face, everyone else in the world who's ever lived faces the exact same thing. The exact three same things. What three sins or ways are we tempted? Lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. All sin comes back to one of those three. That's not new information for us. We're all going to face temptation. We're all going to be tempted to do things that we know are wrong. Does that make us a bad person? Does being tempted make us a bad person? Yeah. Temptation means that there's breath in your body. It means that you're alive, that you're living. The problem is when we give into that temptation and we sin before God. That is where the problem lies. We're all going to be tempted. Tomorrow, Jamie, we're all going to be tempted with something called gluttony. There's going to be a lot of food. For most of us, there's going to be a lot of food. We're all going to be tempted. We're going to be tempted next time we go shopping to not be prideful or greedy. We're going to be tempted when we go out to go to the grocery store and go to the checkout lines. There's temptations all around us. The pictures on the magazines. There's temptations everywhere. It's when we give in to those temptations that we sin. And therefore, we understand that all those temptations, everyone's going to face the same thing, but with everyone, God has given us a way out. God has given us a way to overcome those things. And so specifically with this issue that they're dealing with, what does Paul say in verse 14? What should they flee from? Idolatry. They're to flee from idolatry. We have examples of others who did this. We could, 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 22 tells us to flee from all forms of immorality, all forms of sin. But perhaps the best example is Joseph back in Genesis 39. When Genesis 39 was tempted, not with idolatry, but with lust and adultery, what did Joseph do? Yeah, he ran. He ran. The same idea, I think, applies here. Never stick around to demonstrate how strong you are. Never stick around to demonstrate how strong you think your faith is. We can't, as I like to say in the phrase, we can't white knuckle our way through every situation. There's times that we just got to run. Flee, get out of the situation. And they need to flee from idolatry.
That's really important advice.
Yeah.
Yeah, because God gives us our consciences, for a reason, and they're supposed to not become hardened, and toughened. We have to preserve that sense of understanding quickly when we're not in the right situation for a Christian.
Yeah.
And like you're talking about, get out of that situation if you are in control of where you are. Exercise that control and be wise. Paul says here, I speak as to wise men.
Yeah.
He assumes that they're going to be listening to him and apply what he's saying.
Yeah.
And, that's what we all have to do.
Absolutely.
Not test our consciences, just utilize the conscience that God gave us.
Yeah. There are situations and times where we are in an area and it's hard. We can't just pack up and go at times. I understand that. There's situations that present itself in life that we're going to see and hear things. There's no question about that. But times that we can, we need to avoid those situations. We need to get away from them. And so I think that's an important piece of information that Paul gives us, just to flee. That's just, don't stick around. Just, if it shouldn't be there, if it's a bad thing, just go. I think sometimes we make that more difficult than it needs to be. Just go. I like, go ahead, Jamie.
Two things I was going to say. Number one, obviously, I think in this class, in this setting, we definitely understand this. And as you get older, fleeing becomes a whole lot easier. And we're not even going because I'm tired. I don't want to go anymore.
Yeah.
Or something. But, we all get that. Now, being here and kind of here part of the high school class, it takes me back to that age, or the three girls sitting over there that are young, and Whitney right there, that are truly facing things on a daily basis.
You try to cover it up.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I just think that we need to, and we need to live that. We don't want our children to live in fear of us because we may be a little disappointed.
Yeah.
I mean, trust me, I did a lot of disappointing in my life, you know, growing up. But you can really steer a child the wrong way if you don't give them a little bit of trust and a little bit of, okay, you got there, now let's get out of it and let's talk about it.
Yeah. And I think that's important. That we got to face the consequences of our actions, of our decisions. But that idea of you call, I'm going to come, no questions asked, it kind of ties into what happens in the next section of the text when it talks about in verse 16, is not the cup of blessing which we bless, sharing in the blood of Christ, is not the bread which we break, is sharing in the body of Christ. Since there is one bread, we are many, are one body. When we find ourselves in those situations that are difficult, and maybe we don't have our vehicle with us, or it's difficult, whatever the case may be, we should be able to trust and love our brethren enough that that same general rule that we have for our kids of call me, I will come get you, really for one another. Call me. If you're somewhere you don't need to be or in a situation that's difficult, whether you intended to be there originally or not, call me. No questions asked. I can't take away the consequences, but I can still be there to help you. And we can be there to help each other. And so I think that's an important piece of advice that applies not just to parents and child relationships, but to one another, our relationships with one another. And so that kind of goes into that idea of the Lord's Supper there in verses 16 and 17. Again, is not the cup of blessing which we bless, is sharing in the blood of Christ. Is not the bread which we break, is sharing in the body of Christ. Since there is one bread, we who are many are one body, for we all partake of the one bread. So how does the bread and the cup of the Lord's Supper show our fellowship with Christ and with one another?
Says we are one body, and we partake, we are joined in this one activity together at the same time.
Yeah.
We are in communion. And communion is a special word.
Yeah. Yeah, we are in communion, fellowship, a word that applies there as well. We're in fellowship not only with Christ, we're remembering what he did, but we're doing it together. And this is something I've struggled with, and I've talked to Jeff a little bit about it in the past, that I've struggled with here even in the last year or two. This is a personal thing with Sunday night Lord's Supper things, events, because I feel like this is a very crucial moment of communion together. Not individually. We're doing it together. We're sharing in the body of Christ together. We're sharing in that death together. We're proclaiming our faith together. In Acts chapter 4, what were they doing in the early church? They were all in one accord, and they were going from house to house. They were breaking bread together. And then when they worshiped, they were communing together. The idea of fellowship and being together ran through not only just the Sunday worship service, but all their actions. They were communing and being together and being in fellowship with one another. And so we have that relationship that we have to hold on to as well. We'll hit the brakes there. We'll pick up in we'll talk about this a little bit more Sunday, and then we'll pick up from there and continue on through chapter 10. Thank you.